August 3rd, 1897, Mengo Palace. The heart of Buganda glowed under torchlight, while a storm of gunfire echoed across the hills. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and iron. Inside the royal courtyard, King Mwanga II stood silent with his back straight, his chest rising with slow, steady breaths. In one hand, his royal spear. In the other, the heirloom of his fathers, an ivory staff carved with the names of 36 Kabaka before him. Outside the walls, soldiers marched in strange red coats. The ground shook under the steel feet of empire. The British flag had reached the gates of God's kingdom in Africa. He looked through the smoke toward the sacred hill of Mengo. He could see his people kneeling, praying, hiding their children beneath clay huts as shells exploded around the royal ground. His own council, the Bataka, knelt in a circle behind him, whispering their final prayers to Lubale, the spirit of their ancestors. One elder wept quietly. Mwanga turned his voice cold yet calm. He said, "You can burn the palace, but you will never burn the soul of Buganda." Then the cannons fired again. Stones fell from the palace wall. Fire swept through the royal court, through memories that stretched back 500 years. The war didn't last long. In hours, the drums of Mengo were silent. And in less than a day, the king was chained, dragged away, and exiled to an island across the ocean. His ancestors' throne was gone. His kingdom erased from textbooks. His people told a lie. The world would say Buganda was primitive, that Africa had no parliaments, no law, no civilization until Europeans brought it. But that night, under the burning sky of Mengo, the truth was buried deep beneath the ashes. The truth that Africa, long before colonialism, already had democracy, already had order, already had souls who feared God and honored justice. What happened that night was never random. It was the execution of a plan, a calculated erasure, and that's what this story uncovers. You've heard of empires from books written in London, but not the one that stood in Uganda. You've heard of kings who ruled, but not of kings who sat before a council, who answered to their people, who governed with consensus centuries before Europe thought it possible. Buganda wasn't a tribe, it was a nation. A holy kingdom with codified laws, ministers, judges, and spiritual guardians long before Britain existed as a global power. And when the world discovered that, they decided it was too dangerous to let survive. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Africa was called dark only after its brilliance was hidden. You'll know why British colonizers needed to destroy Buganda to justify what they stole across the continent. And you'll see that the systems that claim to bring democracy to Africa today are built on the ashes of African governments that already practiced it long before the word civilization ever left European tongues. When this is done, you won't see colonial history the same way again. And if your ancestors came from East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's your stolen inheritance. Let's go back to where the truth begins. 400 years before the first British expedition arrived. A time when the kingdom of Buganda was already a giant. Picture it. The year is 1400. On the shores of Lake Nalubale, what outsiders call Lake Victoria, the people of Buganda built a society so organized it stunned the first explorers who dared to record it. The land stretched from the islands of Sesi to the highlands of Kiagwa. The soil was rich, the rivers wide, and every piece of land fell under the guidance of one great council, the Lukiko. The Lukiko was no simple gathering. It was a parliament made of the Bataka, the heads of Buganda's clans, 52 in number. Each one chosen by their people not born into power. They represented hunters, fishermen, traders, farmers, healers. They met weekly in Bulangi under the shadow of the palace hill, and the king, the Kabaka, could not rule without their consent. Every decision from war to taxes, from justice to law, required their voice. The Kabaka was sacred, but not supreme. If he ruled unjustly, the Bataka could remove him. It happened more than once in Buganda's history. The system worked. It was balance. Power shared, not stolen. Compare that to Europe in the same century, where monarchs ruled by divine right, where peasants had no voice, and where democracy was centuries away. The Buganda system was beyond its time. That truth alone could have inspired generations of Africans to believe in their own capacity for self-rule. But when outsiders saw this, they didn't celebrate it. They feared it. Centuries later, in 1837, a child was born who would preserve Buganda's independence against a world that wanted it destroyed. His name was Mukabaya Mutesa Walugembe. He would become Kabaka Mutesa I. His reign would mark the bridge between Africa's old world and the growing shadow of European expansion. Mutesa was tall, broad-shouldered, and brilliant. His eyes were sharp, his voice calm but commanding. When explorers John Hanning Speke and James Grant reached Buganda in 1862, they expected to find what colonial maps called Dark Africa. What they found instead was a palace with courtyards larger than Westminster, guards in orderly formation, councils in debate, laws engraved on bark scrolls and memorized in poetic verse. They saw diplomacy, not darkness. Mutesa treated them not as superiors, but as equals. When Speke spoke of the Queen, Mutesa smiled and said, "Tell her we already have a Queen Mother who blesses our kings." When missionaries brought the Bible, he read it not to convert, but to compare. He studied the Quran, as well curious about Islam. He learned both sides to master both minds. He balanced Islam, Christianity, and traditional faith without surrendering to any. Under his reign, Buganda opened trade routes. With Zanzibar imported rifles, trained soldiers built fortifications and maintained peace across its 30 counties. He transformed Buganda into one of Africa's most stable states by the mid-1800s. His royal court heard appeals every month. Clan judges resolved disputes in public squares. And every season, the Lukiko gathered to debate the state of the kingdom. That wasn't tribal. It was organized governance. It was constitutional monarchy African style. But to the British, that was a problem, because how could they justify civilizing a land that already governed better than their colonies in India? How could they claim superiority when an African monarch debated theology with the intelligence of European scholars? They decided not to tell that story at all. When Mutesa refused to let anyone mission control Buganda, British envoys called him stubborn. When he questioned their motives, they called him paranoid. When he refused to sign protectorate treaties, they called him savage. By the time Mutesa died in 1884, the British had already written his obituary, a tyrant who ruled with superstition and fear. But the truth is, he was the last king who stood free before the colonial storm. His son, Mwanga, would inherit both the crown and the crossfire. Mwanga II came to power at 16. The year was 1884. The world around him was changing fast. Germany claimed Tanganyika. Britain wanted the Nile. Missionaries flooded his kingdom from both sides, Catholic and Protestant, each promising salvation but fighting for power. Mwanga stood before a kingdom divided by foreign faiths and foreign guns. He wanted peace, but peace was no longer his to choose. The breaking point came in May 1886. The church within his palace began recruiting young Buganda into European missions. They called him sinful. They told young men to obey the Bible over the Kabaka. To Mwanga, that was treason. It wasn't about faith, it was about sovereignty. When he confronted his pages, they refused to obey. That defiance wasn't private, it was public. A foreign ideology had turned royal servants against their own king. Mwanga's punishment was brutal. 26 converts were burned alive at Namugongo. Another 6 were executed by the sword. That tragedy would later be sanctified by the Vatican as the death of the Ugandan martyrs. But Western accounts skip the political truth that those martyrs had been trained to oppose their own government, to pledge loyalty to European priests over the Kabaka. Their deaths became propaganda. Mwanga became the monster, and the missionaries became heroes. That story still stands in textbooks today. But here's the truth. Mwanga didn't hate Christians. His queen was Christian. His advisors included both Muslims and believers. What he hated was colonial infiltration disguised as religion. He saw what others missed, that the missionaries' Bible came with a soldier's gun behind it, and he was right. Between 1886 and 1890, British interest in Buganda intensified. Frederick Lugard arrived with the Imperial British East Africa Company and 2 gifts, a flag and a contract. One promised protection, the other demanded surrender. Mwanga refused both. That refusal signed his exile warrant. In 1897, British forces surrounded Mengo Palace under the excuse of protecting Christians from persecution. But they came with 400 Indian soldiers, 50 British troops, and artillery. Mwanga's guards numbered in the hundreds. Some fought with spears, others with muskets bought from Zanzibar traders. When shells flew, they fought bravely. For 3 days, Buganda's drums roared louder than the cannon blasts. Women carried water through fire lines. Priests prayed as bullets tore through the walls. Smoke turned the sky black, and when the palace fell, Mwanga was captured while fleeing toward Lake Victoria. Within a week, a telegram reached London, Buganda, secured. The savage king subdued. No one there saw the tears of the Bataka. No one there heard the crying children hiding behind the royal compound. No one there recorded the words of Mwanga before chains closed on his hands. You can kill the Kabaka, but you will never kill Buganda. The empire celebrated a conquest, but they had exiled the last holy king of Africa's greatest constitutional kingdom. They called it a protectorate, but protection never meant equality. It meant control. Let me show you how deep this control went. Because the story of Buganda doesn't end with Mwanga's capture. What came next dismantled the entire African idea of shared governance. The British didn't just take land, they reversed the meaning of power itself. When Mwanga was shipped to the Seychelles Islands in 1899, he wasn't alone. The Bataka Council was dissolved, clan elders scattered, and British representatives installed as advisors. 2 years later, the colonial government drafted the Uganda Agreement of 1900. On paper, it seemed fair. In spirit, it was theft disguised as diplomacy. Article 6 removed the Kabaka's power to tax. Article 8 gave British officers veto power over all local decisions. Article 10 declared all unassigned land to be Crown land owned by the British monarchy. That's 9,000 square miles of fertile Buganda soil seized overnight. Forests, rivers, gardens, ancestral lands, all reclassified as property of the empire. The Lukiko became a rubber stamp. The Bataka became appointed chiefs. And for the first time in Buganda's 1,000-year history, the Kabaka ruled by foreign permission. Mwanga died in Seychelles in 1903, barely 35 years old. Alone. Forgotten. His grave unmarked for decades. But his message remained, the land belongs to the clans, not the crown. The British rewrote it. They signed it in ink. And then they used schools to erase its memory from the minds of Ugandan children for a century. Hold that thought, because what happened in Buganda wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern. Every time Africans built structured empires, Britain dismantled them. They didn't fear chaos, they feared competition. They couldn't let Africans govern themselves because self-governance destroys the myth of European superiority. But before we trace that pattern, you need to understand exactly what Buganda was before they broke it. Buganda wasn't just a kingdom, it was an idea. The Kabaka ruled spiritually, the Bataka ruled locally, the Lukiko united both. Each clan cared for its land through the Melo system. That word, Milo, comes from mile. Each clan owned square miles of territory passed down through generations. They tilled it, lived on it, and shared it as a collective inheritance. The king could not take it, even if he wanted to. The Bataka managed disputes under local courts. Clan justice guided by truth, not wealth. It worked. That system kept equality alive for 400 years. No slavery, no feudal landlords, no peasant class. Every Buganda was part of a clan, and every clan held land. Imagine that balance. Imagine the power of community when property was sacred but shared. And then came Lugard with contracts that said otherwise. By 1900, Buganda was Britain's internal test colony. What worked there would be exported across Africa. They learned how to manipulate clan divisions, how to reward some and punish others. They created a new class, the loyal chiefs, blackfaces, enforcing white control. Those chiefs resembled power, but answered to British governors. This is what they later called indirect rule. But indirect rule meant the death of indigenous leadership. That single model would spread to Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi. The same blueprint. British officers would stand behind local chiefs and pull the strings. They would call it partnership. It was puppetry. Buganda's story is the first act in that script. And it's time we call it what it was, the theft of African democracy. Let me pause for a moment. If this truth shakes something deep inside you, that's the sign you needed to hear it. Comment the word truth below, because right now you're unlearning what the world has hidden for over a century. Hit that like button if you're done with the lies, and share this video with someone who deserves to know what was stolen. We're only halfway into this story. The revelation gets even deeper from here, because what happened in Buganda was repeated across the continent over and over again. Each time different kings, different lands, same strategy, same destruction. And when you see the pattern, you'll realize this was never about spreading civilization. It was about eliminating competition. Then came Ghana. Then came Zululand. Then came Congo. Every kingdom that stood independent was brought to its knees by the same invisible hand. The British called it progress. The historians called it empire. But behind those polished words was a pattern too perfect to be coincidence. Take the Ashanti Empire. 100 years before Buganda fell, the Ashanti built one of the richest states in West Africa. Their capital was Kumasi. Gold flowed through its markets like water. They had a council system that mirrored a constitution. The Asintehene, the king ruled with advisors chosen from each province. The golden stool was the symbol of national unity, believed to hold the soul of the nation. No one, not even the king, was allowed to sit on it. In 1896, the British invaded. They accused King Prempeh I of barbarism, their favorite word for independence. He refused to surrender the golden stool. So they exiled him to the Seychelles, just like they did to Mwanga. The same island, the same strategy, the same silence. 4 years later in 1900, a British officer named Frederick Hodgson demanded to sit on that stool. It wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate humiliation. And when he made that demand, it ignited a war led not by men, but by a woman, the Queen Mother, Ya Asantewaa. She gathered 2,000 warriors, women and men waving rifles and ancient swords. They fought for 6 months against the empire that ruled half the world. They lost to machine guns, but they proved that spirit could never be conquered. When Ya Asantewaa was captured, they called her a witch. British newspapers mocked her. Her story disappeared for nearly 100 years. Meanwhile, Hodgson retired, with medals celebrated for pacifying the Ashanti. Do you see the pattern beginning? When a man defended his kingdom, they called him tyrant. When a woman defended her nation, they called her witch. But they never called the invaders what they were: thieves hiding behind civilization. Now turn south to 1879. The Zulu kingdom led by King Cetshwayo stood strong in southern Africa. The British sent him a message: disband your army, submit to our authority, or we will invade. Cetshwayo refused. His warriors were proud, trained, disciplined. On January 22, 1879, 20,000 Zulu fighters using nothing but spears and shields crushed 1,800 British troops at Isandlwana. It was the single worst defeat the British Empire had ever suffered in Africa. For a moment, justice roared through the hills, but justice made the empire furious. They returned that same year with 20,000 reinforcements, machine guns blazing. The final battle was at Ulundi. They burned the Zulu capital to ash, captured Cetshwayo, and divided Zululand into 13 smaller states. Divide and conquer, the oldest tactic in the imperial book. Cetshwayo was shipped to Cape Town, humiliated, photographed like a zoo exhibit. And the British bragged that they brought peace to the savages. It was the same story, the same fate. Buganda, Ashanti, Zulu, all structured nations, all with councils and laws and spiritual codes, all rewritten as chaos once they fell. But the chain doesn't stop there. Let me show you Congo. Year 1665, long before colonization had even covered the continent, Portugal invaded the Kingdom of Congo. King Antonio I stood on the battlefield of Mbwila with 5,000 soldiers. Against him came 20,000 Portuguese troops with cannons. He fell in battle. They cut off his head. 5,000 Congolese warriors died beside him. After that, Congo collapsed. By the 1800s, the same land became the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Under his rule, 10 million Africans were murdered for rubber and ivory. 10 million. That's more than all those lost in the transatlantic slave trade from one region of Central Africa alone. They called it the Congo Free State. Free for whom? From Congo to Buganda to Ashanti, each time the same pattern played out. Study the system. Divide its people. Replace leaders with loyal ones. Write a treaty no one can read. Exile the king. Rewrite history. Teach the children only the parts that serve empire. And then call it progress. By the mid-1900s, their mission was done. Africa now looked poor and broken, but poverty was not natural. It was engineered. Let's name the pattern plain. Every time black people built wealth, they destroyed it. Every time Africans built strong governments, they replaced them. Every time our ancestors created order, they called it chaos so they could claim control. That wasn't chaos, it was policy. Think about it. The same British officials who broke Buganda also broke Ashanti. The same people who drafted those treaties faked the idea of protectorates across the continent. They weren't protecting anyone. They were protecting profits. And this leads to the next question you must ask. How did they hide all this? How did they erase an entire civilization from the world's memory? They didn't just conquer kingdoms, they conquered truth. When Mengo Palace burned, every piece of parchment bearing the laws of Buganda went up with it. Royal genealogy, land records, legal codes, they all vanished in flame. Lugard even bragged in his own diary, "We must not let them think they had kings worth remembering." He wrote that. These weren't battles of swords and rifles only. These were wars against memory. The same happened in Benin in 1897. The British invaded under the lie of rescuing wounded envoys. They marched into Benin City with cannons. They killed the royal guards, burned every temple, every home, every library. They carried off 10,000 sculptures, the Benin bronzes. Intricate bronze plaques carved from memory and skill. Each one recorded history, ancestry, and sacred authority. Today, they sit in the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Met. The museums still refuse to give them back. They call it art. But those bronzes are stolen pages of history, proof Africa had literacy and sculpture equal to Europe. And because they couldn't destroy that proof, they displayed it stripped of context. They hid their violence behind paper. In 1900, they turned atrocity into law. The Uganda Agreement stripped the Kabaka of sovereignty. The Native Authority Ordinance of 1919 forced every African chief to obey British governors. They rewrote justice into obedience. They turned every crown into a collar. They tore history out of classrooms. In Uganda, textbooks taught British kings, but never Bugandas. Children learned Shakespeare, not Mutesa. They memorized the Magna Carta, but never the Lukiko Charter. They were told you had no civilization until we came. It worked. By 1960, 2 generations grew up believing Africa was born in darkness. Even after independence, local leaders continued the same policy. Remove the past, keep the people manageable. And the newspapers backed it. London headlines celebrated conquests. Savage kings subdued. Native rebels pacified. Victories printed in black ink over red blood. When Africans fought back, they called them uprisings. When Europeans slaughtered them, they called it expeditions. The public believed it because the papers said it was true. Meanwhile, the missionaries wrote letters about saving souls. They never mentioned the burned churches, the murdered priests who refused colonial control. They said they brought God, but they forgot God had been here long before them, worshipped under trees, sung in drum beats, honored by names older than the English language itself. Now hold that image. A world that calls itself free, built on stolen memory. They burned records, rewrote laws, edited textbooks, and manipulated media. And they did it all so your grandchildren would believe their lie that Africa was invented by Europe. But let's bring it home. Why does this matter now? Why does a kingdom's fall in 1897 matter to you sitting today in 2026 listening to this voice? Because the theft never stopped. It just changed names. Look at the numbers. The average white household in America today holds $188,000 in wealth. The average black household holds $24,000. That's an 8-to-1 gap. Not because of laziness or mismanagement, because every system that built white wealth was funded by black labor and stolen black land. The same applies to Africa. Uganda's GDP per person barely crosses $1,000. The UK sits at $46,000. The gap is the ledger of empire. They didn't just steal gold, they stole systems. Buganda's Malo land system produced stability and inheritance. The British turned it into private property controlled by a few. That's why today 70% of Ugandans live on less than $2 a day. They turned a communal heaven into a corporate prison. If Buganda had developed freely, if the Bataka system had been preserved, families would have owned land across generations. Businesses would have been native-built, not foreign-owned. The wealth gap you see across the world isn't a mystery, it's colonial math. They say slavery ended long ago, but Buganda's subjugation was only 120 years ago. That's within your great-grandparents' lifetime. Reparations aren't ancient claims. They're unpaid bills. Britain ruled Uganda for 68 years. From cotton and coffee exports alone, it extracted $12 billion by today's value. From land seized, another $50 billion. From labor exploitation, $30 billion more. $92 billion owed. 40% of that from Buganda territory alone. That's $36 billion owed to the Buganda people. Divide that today among 10 million descendants, that's over $3,000 per person. Add compound interest over 60 years, and the debt rises to $60,000 each. That's not charity, that's restitution. And yet nothing has been paid. They call it history. We call it theft. Even now, land grabs continue. Millions of hectares of African land sold to foreign investors since 2000. Oil in Uganda drilled by Western corporations profits, leaving while locals receive scraps. Colonialism never ended, it rebranded as development. And if you think that doesn't touch you, wherever you live, think again. Gentrification pushing out black families from Brooklyn, Atlanta, New Orleans, that's the same tactic as the Uganda Agreement. Devalue neighborhoods, raise taxes, praise it as progress, force people out, rename the streets. Same theft, new language. Mass incarceration. That's modern slavery. The 13th Amendment allows forced labor as punishment for crime. 2 million people in U.S. prisons right now. 40% are black, even though black people are 13% of the population. Convict leasing rebuilt plantations with new chains. The British used prisoner labor in Uganda to build railways. America uses prisoners to make goods for pennies. History rhymes because the handwriting hasn't changed. Police brutality, look closer. Colonial officers became local police. Their function was the same, to protect property and suppress subjects. Colonial security forces punished resistance the same way modern officers patrol protest lines. The badge replaced the whip, but the purpose remained control. So when you see the footage, when you hear the names George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Walter Scott, understand the origin. These are not separate tragedies. They are contemporary echoes of empire. Now here's the question, only you can answer: how long do we allow truth to stay buried? How long do we repeat their lies when we could reclaim our memory? Because reclaiming history means reclaiming power. Your ancestors were not powerless victims. They were thinkers, builders, diplomats, warriors, and believers. The Kabaka of Buganda was as sophisticated as any European monarch. The Bataka were elected leaders centuries before British democracy existed. Ya Asantewa fought as fearlessly as any general. King Cetshwayo outplanned the greatest army in the world. These are your roots. Their blood runs through you. Their victories live in your DNA. You are not descendants of poverty. You are descendants of kingdoms. And they want you to forget that because memory sparks movement. So hear me. You are not victims. You are survivors of genocide. You are descendants of warriors who stood against empires. You are heirs to stolen empires. Your poverty isn't your fault. It was engineered. Your resilience is proof of divine purpose, because God didn't preserve your ancestors through centuries of chains just to disappear you now. He kept you alive for revelation, for truth, for restoration. If this truth moved you, take action right now. Comment truth below. Share this with your children. Tell them they come from kings and queens who ruled with wisdom. Do not let them erase us again. Subscribe not for numbers, but for mission. Because each story we uncover repairs the timeline they fractured. And now, before we close, let's return to faith. Father God, we thank you for keeping this knowledge alive beneath the ashes. We thank you for the warriors and leaders who carried your light through the darkness. We pray for justice for every victim of empire. We pray for restoration of what was stolen. Let truth rise again in the hearts of all your people. Bless those who seek knowledge. Strengthen those who stand for righteousness. And let the memory of our ancestors be vindicated in our time. In Jesus' name, Amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. You are free. This is Dark History Stories. Until next time, remember who you are, reclaim what they stole, and pass the torch so the world can never again forget Buganda. The drums of Buganda keep beating even now. You may not hear them with your ears, but your spirit does. Every story that was buried rises each time we speak truth aloud. The wind still whispers the names of Kabaka Mwanga and Mutesa, of Ya Asantewaa, of King Cetshwayo, of Haile Selassie, who stood before the nations and declared that God and history would judge imperialism. And here's what history proves. They tried to burn our palaces, but we rebuilt churches. They tried to steal our land, but we grew new laws. They exiled our kings, but we crowned memory. Every time they tore pages out of our story, we wrote more lines in song, and sermon, and story. Whether in Harlem or in Kampala, the rhythm of resistance lived on. This story doesn't end in ruins. It ends in awakening. Every time you share a truth like this, you light a torch where the world told you only darkness lived. Every conversation, every lesson, every remembered ancestor is a victory. And the same God who saw Mwanga exiled, saw your grandparents fight segregation, saw you still praying today, still rising, still seeking justice. They told you Buganda fell in 1897, but the kingdom still stands. The people still gather at Mengo Hill. The Kabaka still leads in spirit and ceremony. The children still sing songs about kings that Britain tried to erase. And that right there is proof of prophecy. Truth can never die. It only waits for ears ready to hear it. So keep remembering, keep seeking, keep teaching. When you tell your children who they are, you restore everything that fire tried to erase. The war for history was never just about the past. It's about faith in what black hands can build once truth returns to the throne. You are royalty in exile, learning to reclaim your crown. Every prayer, Every act of love and courage, every refusal to let injustice stand is your coronation. Remember Buganda. Remember all kingdoms torn down by lies. Remember that freedom didn't begin in Europe, it began in the first councils of Africa under divine law. And that spirit lives in you. Take this truth with you. Speak it over your home tonight. Let your heart be the drum that no empire can silence. God brought you here right now to remember. The story is yours now. Guard it well. Let me tell you something they never put in the textbooks. When Buganda's royal palace burned, when the Bataka were scattered, when Mwanga was chained, the people didn't stop praying. They didn't stop governing themselves. They simply went underground. Whole clans moved their sacred instruments into hidden shrines deep in the forests by Lake Victoria. Elders met at night around small fires to retell the laws while British soldiers patrolled the roads. That's why the culture survived. They could destroy buildings and titles, but not conscience. That's how truth moves. It hides inside memory until the right generation calls it forth again. Generations later, that generation is you. The rediscovery of Africa's political genius didn't begin in universities, it began in living rooms, in conversations like this. Every time someone learns that the Kabaka ruled with a council, you challenge the colonial myth. Every time someone learns that Buganda had written law, you weaken the empire's foundation. Truth itself becomes warfare, and you're holding the weapon they can't confiscate any more knowledge. When scholars began to reopen archives in the 1960s and 70s, they found fragments of Buganda law hidden in missionary journals, written begrudgingly by men who had witnessed it. One wrote that the Baganda talked government ceaselessly. Another complained that the Lukiko spent too long debating laws when Europeans would simply order them. To him, that patience was foolish. To us, it's proof of a democratic soul. Even in the notes of their colonizers, you can see the light of civilization shining through their prejudice. What the British called indirect rule was a theft not just of land, but of the very concept of self-rule. They didn't invent governance for Africa, they crippled what already worked. Before 1880, Buganda had fewer recorded civil wars in 2 centuries than England had in 50 years. Its roads were safer than London's alleys. Its royal court tried cases of theft with elders as jurors. When citizens disagreed, they came before the Bataka instead of taking revenge. That's not barbarism, that's a legal system functioning under spiritual oversight. Compare that record to Europe's own history. At the same time plague, religious wars, and monarchy after monarchy collapsing. Yet they had the nerve to call anyone uncivilized. It should tell you how powerful propaganda can be. Truth was never their goal. Ownership was. You see, when people believe their ancestors were violent or chaotic, they stop trusting themselves to lead. They start accepting that somebody else must control them. That lie is the root of modern inequality. Every system today that says Africa needs foreign guidance owes its power to the old myth that Africans never govern themselves properly. Now imagine if every child from Detroit to Kampala to Lagos to Kingston understood what Buganda truly was, a sophisticated African polity that survived over 5 centuries through balance of power, consensus, and faith. Imagine what kind of self-respect that would build. This is why the erasure continues. Because knowledge of greatness makes control impossible. Let's talk about the resistance nobody names. During the years after Mwanga's exile, British rule seemed secure. But from 1900 to 1915, Countless acts of quiet defiance filled Buganda. Farmers refused to give up yields for colonial taxes. Teachers taught Luganda secretly alongside English hymns. Women's guilds met under the guise of Bible study to discuss community aid and preserve clan traditions. When war broke out in Europe, they drafted thousands of Ugandans to fight a foreign war. Those soldiers came back asking questions: if we fight for the King of England, who fights for the Kabaka of Buganda? Those questions gave birth to nationalism long before political parties existed. By the time independence movement spread in the 1950s, Buganda's memory was the compass that guided them. Even politicians who didn't follow its monarchy still referenced its structure when building constitutions. The Ugandan parliament you know today is modeled knowingly or not after the Lukiko. The simple idea that citizens gather through representatives to advise a leader that came from within Africa first. Let that sink in. So why does it still feel like these truths are hidden? Because silence was institutionalized. Even after independence, governments feared the unifying power of truth. Presidents like Milton Obote dismantled the traditional structure, completely turning Kabaka Mutesa II into an exile just like his ancestor Mwanga. In 1966, Ugandan troops attacked the palace again. History repeated, and once more the flames rose at Mengo Hill. They said it was politics, but underneath was something deeper: fear. Fear of a governing philosophy rooted in people, not party. Every authoritarian fears the idea of accountable kingship, where leadership answers to elders and God simultaneously. The smoke cleared, but the spirit didn't die. In 1993, they restored the Kabaka, though ceremonial. That act alone revived sleeping memory. Tens of thousands came to the coronation, old men weeping with drums in hand after decades of silence. They proved the Song of Buganda wasn't erased, it was waiting. What does that mean for you right now? It means every time you learn and share, you're lighting torches our ancestors dreamed we'd carry. Each truth spoken is restitution more powerful than any court payment. Money fades, land shifts, but understanding restores dignity forever. Still, restitution in material form must follow, because understanding without repair keeps the wound open. Imagine a bank account left unpaid for 100 years. The debt doesn't vanish because the banker died. The debt transfers. Britain's wealth was built on African extraction: gold from Ashanti, coffee cotton, ivory from Buganda, diamonds from South Africa. Wealth compounded while Africa's development was frozen deliberately through trade restrictions. The World Bank itself grew from systems designed to manage former colonies, not free them. These are not abstract theories. They're line items on ledgers stored in archives. And if you ever doubt the scale, walk through the British Museum. Those walls are filled with the receipts. Every sculpture, every scroll, every bronze taken under the empire's name is unpaid collateral on the African future. But here is the divine irony. In trying so hard to erase us, they recorded everything they did. They wrote diaries, reports, and shipping lists that now serve as evidence against them. Their arrogance preserved our proof. That's how God works. Even evil writes its own confession. So the question becomes not will the truth come out, but what will we do with it once it's free? It's not enough to simply know. Justice is motion. Families across the diaspora must reconnect to these lineages. Buganda's clans: the lion, the elephant, the leopard, the monkey. Each represent virtues our communities still need: strength, strategy, leadership, joy. These are cultural blueprints for uniting identity. If we pass them to our children, we restore the psychological wealth stolen alongside the material. Teach them about the Bataka system, and they'll understand community accountability. Teach them about the Lukiko, and they'll understand consensus democracy. Teach them about the Kabaka's duty to God, and they'll understand servant leadership. That's education for liberation. Do this at home, in churches, in barbershops, in classrooms, wherever history was silenced. Because revival doesn't always start in legislatures, it begins in conversation. Think about what happens when you gather younger generations and tell them their bloodline once governed one of the most advanced states in pre-colonial Africa. It shifts posture. It raises gaze. It breaks inferiority before it can root. That's why this video matters. Not to glorify monarchies, but to resurrect confidence that Africans and their descendants were and are capable of perfecting governance. Now bring this reflection into today's fight for equity. The same mindset that erased Buganda's Lukiko still shapes financial policy. Systems that keep nations indebted mirror the treaties colonizers drafted a century ago. Loans disguised as aid interest rates that strip the land of value. It's neo-colonialism written in economic script. Recognizing Buganda's fall helps you see through modern deception. When global institutions say, Africa needs guidance, remember we had constitutions when Europe had crusades. The next step is collective awakening. Historical knowledge must merge with contemporary activism. Churches, mosques, social groups all can become centers of rediscovery. Because faith communities once drove both colonization and liberation. The same book misused to justify empire also carries the story of Exodus. When interpreted with justice, Scripture frees rather than chains. God always sides with the oppressed, rising toward truth. That's what your ancestors believed. Every war drum, every hymn, every liberation chant carried that same message: we are not forsaken. If that spirit could endure centuries of suppression, it can endure economic struggle today. The legacy of Buganda teaches us responsibility alongside pride. Leadership must serve, not rule. Justice must guide, not dominate. And memory must inform, not embitter. There's one more truth the empire never wanted revealed. Buganda's democracy wasn't secular, it was sacred. The Kabaka served as political leader and priest-king, a bridge between people and creator. Laws were built on moral order. Breaking them wasn't just a crime against man, it was sin against heaven. That moral foundation was what made the system strong and what colonial rulers feared most. Because once people believe leadership comes from God through community rather than from empire through conquest, oppression crumbles. Reclaiming that sacred governance could heal modern corruption. Imagine if presidents and ministers today understood themselves as stewards, answerable to councils of elders and the divine. That model could transform nations riddled with greed. It's not nostalgia. It's blueprints for the future stored inside ancient memory. So as this revelation settles in, you take a breath and feel the weight of lineage. You are living proof that truth survived. Let that realization humble and empower you simultaneously. Because revelation without responsibility is noise, but revelation with action is revolution. Here's what action looks like right now. Support local historians and educators, bringing African history into classrooms. Digitize family stories. Build scholarships in the names of forgotten ancestors. Lobby your representatives for the return of stolen artifacts. And above all, live like royalty, in humility and excellence, so the world sees the true reflection of where you come from. When doubt creeps in, remember how far this memory traveled. Across oceans through slavery, colonization, segregation, incarceration, and still here you are, listening, breathing, believing. That survival is a prophecy fulfilled. Let's close where we began, on Mengo Hill. The night the palace burned, an old drummer hid behind ruined walls, holding his small drum under his cloak. When British officers marched past, he waited until they left, then began tapping a rhythm so faint it sounded like the heartbeat of the earth. One by one, villagers crept back following the sound. Within hours, the hill echoed with hundreds of drums. Firelight flickered over faces wet with tears, but the rhythm grew steadier. People sang a single line, "The kingdom still lives." That line has never stopped echoing. So as you move through your days, carry that same rhythm. Speak truth calmly but relentlessly. Walk with dignity, born of memory. And whenever someone tells you Africa was darkness before Europe, just smile and reply, the only darkness was the ink they used to hide the light. Because now you know. Now you are the light.